Welcome to Woodland Park Zoo's One Wild World, examining the intersection of animals, humans, and habitats in a global pandemic. This three-part series is possible thanks to financial support from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and is brought to you live from this studio in Seattle thanks to Seattle Lives and PNTA. I'm Farah Paul, Director of Public Relations and Community Affairs at Woodland Park Zoo, and I'll be your moderator for today's event called One World, How an Animal and a Human Changed Global Health. Last week, we explored the topics of species and spaces of the Pacific Northwest. That episode, and episode 1 about animals and human care and the role of zoos, is now available to watch at zoo.org/onewildworld. And wow, do we have an incredible show for you today. Our lineup of guests is top-notch, and we're going to give you so much to think about. It's going to be really great. Our in-studio panel will be socially distancing, and we'll be wearing our masks when we can to keep each other safe. We also have some amazing live and pre-recorded guests that will be joining us throughout the hour. Before we get started, I'd like to ask all of you a question for our live poll. So please open your chat function and type in your responses. Here's the question. Do you believe wildlife conservation is part of preventative global health care? I'll read that one more time. Do you believe that wildlife conservation is part of preventative global health care? Type 1 for, I have no idea. Type 2 for, I can see some connection. Type 3 for, I can see a lot of connection. Or type 4 for, I believe they are critically tied together. I'll give you a minute to respond, and we'll check the results shortly. While you're typing in your answers, let's meet our panel. Dr. Darin is Director of Animal Health Programs at Woodland Park Zoo. Dr. Erin Meyer, Director of Conservation Programs and Partnerships at Seattle Aquarium. Dr. Stephen Kern, Deputy Director of Quantitative Science for Global Health Integrated Development at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and Mr. Xiaoshun Zeng, doctoral candidate in the China Studies Program of the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington. Welcome.
Hi.
So, Mr. Zeng, you're here today to help us talk about Chinese history and culture, and I understand that your Chinese zodiac is also your favorite animal.
Yeah, I was born in the year of tiger, and actually tiger is my favorite animal. In fact, tiger is a very important cultural symbol in China, and from history we know that in the past there have been a huge population of tigers in China, especially the South China tiger species. Unfortunately, in the past several hundred years, the population of tiger has decreased dramatically, especially in the 20th century. I mean, in the 1950s and 60s, the government encouraged a lot of hunting for tigers, and also because of habitat loss due to human settlement expansion. So currently, South China tiger is critically endangered or even extinct in the wild. So that's a concern for all of us.
Well, thanks for sharing and thanks for being here. In episode 1, we talked a lot about tigers, and I know we're going to be doing that again later in this episode. Dr. Collins, thanks for being here. Well, we work together, and I know that you love your job providing veterinary care for animals at the zoo, but I also know that you have really deep curiosity, and you love to explore and learn and find new things. Can you tell us how that curiosity took you to Indonesia for 2 years?
Thank you, Farah. I have been at the zoo for about 30 years now, and for about 15 years I've been working in Indonesia, and I ended up having a chance to actually live and work in Indonesia for 2 years, back in 2008, 2009. And the idea for me was to explore the cultural connections between the wildlife and the people of Indonesia. And we were actually working on a pandemic bird flu project and looking at those connections between the Indonesian people and their disease risk exposures to H5N1, which was the virus at that time that was spilling over into the human population.
Well, thanks for being here, Darin. I'm excited to hear more from you in a few minutes. Dr. Kern, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So your expertise is in pandemics, and you work on therapeutic treatments for infectious diseases. I understand that that work takes you all over the world, where you get to know communities and you look for some of the solutions to these global health challenges. Can you talk about some of your travels?
Yeah, in fact, I've been to Indonesia, and most recently, one of the places where one of our big projects has been reading out has been in Indonesia, in the city of Yogyakarta, which is really great in the center island of Java. And so I get to travel to a wide range of places, from small villages that are in very rural settings to large mega cities like Rio de Janeiro. And I think we have a picture of the area called Rocinha, and Rocinha is a famous or an infamous, what they call a mass agglomeration of people, or a favela. So it's a place where people live really close to one another, sometimes on top of each other, and it's a place where a lot of the diseases that the Gates Foundation is focused on can spread very easily. And so I get to work across all those different areas, and the great thing about traveling to those places is to meet the people that live there, understand their perspective of what they need assistance with, and then try to help them in ways that they find are useful.
Well, I'm sure everyone's really looking forward to hearing more from you in a few minutes. Dr. Meyer, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So you're a marine biologist, and I understand that because of 90s TV, there's a lot of misunderstandings about what you do. What do people think that you do?
Yeah, so thanks to shows like Flipper and SeaQuest, which I loved when I was a kid, and the rise of SeaWorld, when I tell people that I'm a marine biologist, I get about the same reaction every time. First, I always wanted to be a marine biologist, with an interesting undertone of, but I selected a more sensible career. And then that's usually followed by, do you swim with dolphins? I've always wanted to do that. And while I have been in the water and in various vessels with marine mammals swimming around unexpectedly, I actually spent most of my academic career studying snails and clams. And if I tell people that, it's pretty much a conversation stopper. So I usually pretty quickly pivot to the fact that my career, like yours, has taken me to countries all around the world that I have explored and to learn, research, and explore everything from kelp forests to coral reefs to rocky shores to human connections to the ocean. And it's taken me, I feel, full circle back to the place where I was born, here in Seattle, where I work for the Seattle Aquarium to lead our research, field conservation, and policy advocacy work here and in Indonesia.
Well, I grew up watching those shows, so I can see where people got those ideas. If you're just joining us, welcome to One Wild World, and our final episode of the series, One World, How a Human and an Animal Changed Global Health. Let's now pull up the results of the live poll. We asked you, do you believe wildlife conservation is part of preventative global health care? Wow, it looks like so far 91% of you have said that you believe that they are critically tied together. And the rest of you have said that you can see some connection, and I think that's great too. We're going to revisit this question later in the episode. To help give you all an idea about where this discussion's going today, you can sort of think of it in three buckets. First, we're going to talk about health in the pandemic. Then we'll talk about culture and conservation, and then we'll talk about wildlife trafficking. And at the end, we'll wrap it up with a what's next. So Dr. Meyer, today we're going to be talking about the coronavirus pandemic and the relationship to human and animal health. We're going to be talking about conservation and wildlife trafficking around the world, and we're going to be talking about culture and technology and environmental justice. On the surface, those things may not seem connected, but in fact, they are very tied together. Can you help explain for us how conservation and healthcare and trafficking are tied together?
Sure. So at its most basic, and I think we seem to have an audience who maybe gets it, human health, environmental justice, and conservation are inextricably linked. You know, if you look at the CDC statistics, the people who are, Black, Indigenous, Asian, and Hispanic are far more risk of feeling the impacts and of more deep impacts of COVID-19. And those are the same communities who are at greater risk of experiencing exposure to the harmful effects of environmental pollution. And for those of you here in Washington, you can look at the Washington Health Disparities Map to dig into that a little bit. And so it's pretty obvious, I think, the links between human health and environmental justice, but where does conservation fit in? So conservation at its most basic, if we talk about the COVID-19 pandemic, as you mentioned, of course, it tracks back to wildlife trafficking, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that over the course of this episode. But at its most basic, conservation is about restoring, stewarding, and protecting lands and waters. It's about the interconnectedness of all living things across ecosystems and around the world, and humans are a part of those ecosystems. We're not separate from it. So at its most broad, conservation is by definition about human health, and environmental justice.
Thanks for tying that together for us, Erin. Before we explore these interconnected topics with our in-studio panel, I'd like to introduce Dr. Lucas Joppa, Chief Environmental Officer for Microsoft. Dr. Joppa is using technology to explore solutions to global challenges like the ones we're discussing today. Dr. Joppa, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm sure everyone today who's watching is here because they care about animals. And I hear that you have a special affection for reptiles. Is that right?
I'm here because I care about animals, and I kind of got down this career path, yeah, because I have a passion for reptiles. When I was a kid, I wanted to be a herpetologist. I wanted to study snakes. Did that as best as I could, in my own backyard and in the woods of northern Wisconsin. I kind of pursued that for a while until I started my PhD. And I told my PhD advisor, who's a fairly well-known ornithologist, that I wanted to be a herpetologist. And he said, "You can do anything you want in this lab except that." Because, so he told me that he'd made my wife a promise to keep me safe, and he didn't know any herpetologist with all 10 fingers. So.
Well, we're going to meet some animal keepers in a minute that do have all 10 fingers, so don't worry about that. We're talking a lot this afternoon about sustainability. And when we talk about sustainability, we're talking about healthy human populations and communities, and we're also talking about healthy animal populations. As Microsoft's Chief Environmental Officer, you lead their sustainability. Can you tell us how your work is a little different to a traditional sustainability role?
Well, yeah, I think that my work is different from a traditional sustainability role now, but I don't think that it will be different from a traditional sustainability role 10 years from now. My work really oversees, of course, what you might think of from traditional sustainability, what I would call operational sustainability, ensuring that the way that our products and facilities are sourced, manufactured, managed and operated and then managed at end of life, that's all done as sustainably as possible. That's part of my job. But at a big tech company like Microsoft, I think that's really kind of the minimum bar for addressing the opportunity. It's really about trying to figure out how the scalable technologies that we produce can help scale conservation and can help scale sustainability solutions. And actually, the way that I got into the sustainability field was I was in Microsoft Research, leading research programs at the intersection of environmental and computer science, and started a program called AI for Earth that was dedicated to deploying what Microsoft does well, scalable machine learning and artificial intelligence in the cloud, purposefully for biodiversity conservation.
Well, speaking of AI for Earth, I understand that you actually started this program. Can you tell us how it's being used for wildlife, for instance, with population tracking or anti-poaching efforts?
Sure. So AI for Earth, I did start the program. I wrote a memo that ultimately became what I titled AI for Earth as an early marketing lesson for me. I didn't call it AI for Earth, and nobody paid any attention to it. And then I called it AI for Earth, and everybody paid attention to it. So, but what AI for Earth is a 5-year, to begin with, $50 million investment in machine learning approaches to biodiversity conservation and other sustainability challenges. We started that with nothing but an idea on a piece of paper, and over the past few years we've grown it into a program that's supporting more than 650 organizations in more than 90 countries around the world. And what some of those organizations are doing is really incredible. They're really scaling up our knowledge about the natural world and helping create more rapid decision-making frameworks for how to conserve species. I think there's some of my favorite applications in our grantee portfolio are organizations like iNaturalist, a smartphone application that has millions of users all around the world that now collect more biodiversity information combined than all governments combined, right? Or WildMe, organization that uses computer vision to identify not just species but individuals of each species to really ramp up the speed at which we can do population assessments. They've discovered more individual whale sharks on Earth, 10 times more individual whale sharks on Earth using this technology than humans have in history. So, and these are really small organizations, but they're able to rest their work on the incredible scalable technologies that that companies like Microsoft have developed.
Well, including Woodland Park Zoo, I know that we use a lot of your technology, and we're really grateful for that partnership. You know, I've heard you say that we know a lot about a little and a little about a lot. Through the lens of health, environment, conservation, and wildlife trafficking, what does that mean to you, and how can technology help us change that?
Well, it means that we're going to constantly be behind on our response to conservation unless we change it. So I do say that a lot. The other thing that I say a lot is that we talk a lot about this information age that we exist within. But the fact is that that term information age is one of the most narcissistic terms that we've ever come up with, because we know a lot. When I say a lot about a little, I mean we know a lot about ourselves. But when you put humans in the context of life on Earth, we are little. And we know very little about the rest of life on Earth. And that we do to our detriment. We do to our detriment because, of course, we rely on all of the natural resources to support our overall human societies and our human experience, but also because it's the resilience, the stability, and the health of our natural systems, ultimately, that will dictate the health of our human societies. We're seeing that in the COVID pandemic that we're currently living within. I think one of the things that we have to be appreciative of and empathetic to is that while this is a pandemic, a global disease outbreak, it's far from the first disease that has had ravaging impacts on human economies and societies in far-flung places of around the globe that we can all trace back to a fundamental breakdown of natural systems. And so getting out ahead instead of constantly being behind, you asked, what does it mean for me? It means fundamentally building a sustainable human population on Earth.
Well, thank you so much for being here. We're actually going to hear more about some of those past pandemics and the impacts that they've had on us as humans and on our habitat. For those of you that want to learn more about Dr. Joppa and his work, we're posting some links in the live chat. And Dr. Joppa, as a special thanks for joining us today, our next guest is here especially for you. Thanks for being here.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Well, isn't she gorgeous? Here with us is Rachel Salant. She's an ambassador animal and behavioral husbandry curator at Woodland Park Zoo. Hi, Rachel.
Hi, Farah.
Thanks for being back again today.
Of course, it's our pleasure.
So who do we have here?
I would love to introduce everybody to Anahi. Anahi is our 10-year-old red-tailed boa constrictor. They're native to South America, and she is one of our ambassador animals, which means she's really comfortable coming out and giving guests an up-close experience so that they can appreciate her beauty up close. Yep.
Well, I know that one of the questions you often get about Anahi is about her size, and she's a pretty big gal.
She's a big gal. So a red-tailed boa constrictor can reach pretty big lengths. Right now, Anahi, at 10 years old, weighs about 30 pounds and is approximately 7.5 feet long. As a female, they are bigger than males, and so we expect her to keep growing. She will continue to grow throughout her life. Every time she sheds her skin, she gets a little bit bigger.
Well, you just heard Dr. Lucas Joppa saying he's got a special affection for reptiles, but not everyone feels that way. Some people are afraid of them, or they get sort of a bad rap, or there's misconceptions. Yeah. What would you want people to know about snakes like this?
You know, I can really understand that instinct, because when you look at Anahi, she looks quite different than we do. Can you imagine trying to move through this world without any hands or arms or legs? And when we look at her, it seems like we don't have anything in common, or that we don't identify with each other. But really what I want people to know is that can't be further from the truth. I mean, Anahi is an individual. She has her likes and dislikes, and we know what those are. And I wouldn't expect them to be the same likes and dislikes as another red-tailed boa. And so when you think about it in that context, that she's an individual and we're all individuals, it makes it a lot easier to identify with them. And we're all very similar, just trying to make our living in this world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I feel like she's looking at me right now.
She might be.
So we're talking today about health and conservation and wildlife trafficking. What can Anahi teach us about that?
So as I mentioned, red-tailed boas are native to South America. And unfortunately, those rainforests fall victim to things like deforestation, and red-tailed boas unfortunately fall victim to wildlife trafficking and the wildlife pet trade. And so I think Anahi is here representing red-tailed boas, and that when we look at her, we should see one species that's part of a really large ecosystem that's really all connected. And so her health and our health and the health of those jungles are all interconnected. So she's just one piece of that puzzle.
Well, thanks for being here, Rachel. Thanks for being here, Anahi. I hope all of you have enjoyed meeting our red-tailed boa constrictor. And let's go back to our main stage. So as you've heard, today we're going to be talking about a whole variety of things. And I think that what I'd like to do next is come back to Dr. Darin to talk about animal health. Dr. Darin, over the past 2 episodes, we've talked a lot about threats to animals. We've talked about trafficking, we've talked about habitat loss, and today we're going to be talking about health, which is particularly resonant with what you do. So can you talk to us about animal health in the framework of this pandemic?
Animal health is my job. It's my career, my profession, and I've known all my life that this is what I wanted to do. And in my day-to-day work, it's really about keeping the animal population healthy. And we start that process before they ever even come to the zoo, screening for disease. And during a quarantine period, we're trying to contain anything that might be a pathogen for the other animals at the zoo. And then disease surveillance at the zoo so that we're ahead of the disease game, if you will, and we're preventing disease before it ever happens. When it does happen, we're there to respond, and we are specialists in our field, the whole animal health team at the Woodland Park Zoo, and we'd like to call upon our super specialist consultant friends on those occasions when we need the technology or we need the specialized surgical expertise, for example, to help us through a case. And the end game is the animals get the best care possible and the best outcomes are possible. So it's very gratifying work to know that we're providing the best care possible for the animals at the zoo.
Thank you. And I've heard you talk about the zoo in terms of why it's important that we maintain healthy populations, and some of the things that folks who visit zoos, they might not take for granted, but they might not be considering when they come. Can you talk about that a little bit?
We are definitely behind the scenes, but we're there every day, and we're working every day to make sure the animals stay on the best nutrition possible, that we're ahead of any signs of disease before it becomes more advanced. And interventions then are part of our day-to-day routine. We have clinical appointments at the zoo hospital, birds, mammals, reptiles, amphibians. Everybody's been a patient of mine, of ours, and we see them through the whole life that they spend here at Woodland Park Zoo.
Thanks. And you've touched on this a little bit. Can you talk about some of the general pandemic preparedness? You've said that part of your work is setting us up before animals get sick, and then part of it is responding when they do. Talk a little bit more about that process.
We are aware of the potential pathogens that might impact an animal group at the zoo. So we're testing for that. We're using our tests, our technology to make a diagnostic result that can screen animals or diagnose them for a disease condition. Animals, before they even come into the zoo, go into a period of quarantine. And I know in the earlier episodes, we talked about the new Malayan tiger that's in Seattle, that was in New York, and she's in quarantine currently. And so we're looking day to day, very close observations for any sign of disease. So she's doing great, she looks great, she's got normal appetite and activity, and that's just one example of how we're containing, screening for potential disease, because this tiger was exposed to COVID-19, was diagnosed with COVID-19, had symptoms consistent with COVID-19, and the treatment, the supportive treatment, was successful, and she's asymptomatic at this point. That's a tiger, not a human, but we're dealing with the same virus, and it's my job and the job of the animal health professionals at the zoo to contain that disease and keep that from spreading into the population already there.
Thanks, Dr. Collins. Dr. Curran, we're hearing Dr. Collins talk about some of the prevention and containment. In the case of COVID-19, it's already here. So can you talk to us a little bit on the human health side about how you're working on therapeutic treatments for this pandemic, and especially how does data play a role in that?
Yeah, I'm happy to, Farah. I mean, as Dr. Collins mentioned, the zoo is thinking about things in a very proactive way. They're anticipating problems and they're anticipating issues, and so they're testing and they're looking for those. We didn't do that with COVID-19, of course, and so we're caught behind. And even to the same point that Lucas made, we're oftentimes behind in terms of trying to catch up with information, and that's certainly been the case with COVID-19. So we've had to then try to take, well, what drugs and what therapeutics do we have available to us now? Could any of those be helpful in at least mitigating the symptoms, not curing, but mitigating the symptoms of the disease? So we spent a lot of time essentially looking through the data of people who are taking medications on a regular basis and then comparing them to a population that's similar and saying, do the patients that take this medication seem to be doing better than those that take this other one? And it's actually given us some good insights of paths that then we can follow along on an attempt to find good therapeutics that can help us mitigate the symptoms of COVID-19 until we get to a vaccine. And I think that's one of the strategies that we're continuing to employ. The key to be able to do that is that people have to be willing to share their data and to let each other see what information and knowledge we have. And again, that's something that's hard to do in the midst of a pandemic if you haven't been doing it every day. So partly, I think one of the things we're learning is how to prepare for future challenges and using this instance as a way to be better for the next time around.
I think that's so interesting. And I understand that professionally, this is the third pandemic that you've worked on. Are there any patterns that you've seen that we can learn from?
Well, usually we're behind, usually that we didn't expect it was going to happen, and usually that we have to catch up, right? So yeah, this is I say to people, it's my third pandemic. And the first was Ebola, the second was Zika, the third is this COVID-19. And they're all viruses that essentially originated in animals and were transferred to humans. And they get transferred to humans through a whole bunch of different patterns. And so I think in similar ways to what Dr. Myers mentioned earlier in her comments, this interplay with the environment is really key, because as humans start to encroach on the environment or have influence that changes the environment, we're going to have more of these diseases coming present. One that I work on, the Zika outbreak that came up in 2017 and 2016. Zika is also transmitted by the same mosquito that transmits dengue, yellow fever, chikungunya. So one mosquito, 4 diseases, generally focuses in urban areas. You don't have it very much in the United States, a little bit in the south. But as our weather warms, then that mosquito, Aedes aegypti, is starting to move forward north. And so it's not unforeseeable that San Francisco, maybe even Seattle, could have to deal with dengue at some time off in the future if we don't get a better handle on how we can, essentially work with our environment in a more constructive way and essentially help us, mitigate those challenges.
Thanks, Steve. Mr. Zeng, I have a question for you. It's believed that this pandemic first impacted people in China. And as a result, China's been really central to this conversation about the coronavirus. There have been people who've given this coronavirus racist and derogatory nicknames, and it's created a lot of cultural issues. In your research about health and medicine and race, can you talk to us about your observations about why it's problematic connecting a pandemic to a population of people or a place?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So for my research of history medicine, I found that there was often a tendency when a new disease emerged to name that disease with a specific population group, or sometimes even a group of animals or a place names. And that can be a big problem because one of the issues is that naming a disease after a specific population or place names can create a stigma for that specific group. For instance, we've heard about the Spanish flu, which was actually the 1918 flu pandemic, but there's basically no evidence to show that the flu actually originated in Spain, and some historians even suggest it originated in Kansas, but there's definitely no consensus about that. And often, naming a disease after a specific population group can create a strong stigma and social issues such as, the HIV and AIDS. We all know that in early years when the gay men communities in the United States were particularly hit by HIV and AIDS, the disease was even reframed as a gay disease. And actually in 2015, the WHO created a new guideline for the best practices for naming new human disease. And according to this new WHO guideline, it is not appropriate to name a disease, with specific population groups or geographic names or animals or even some cultural or industry occupational references. So, I think the COVID-19 is a really good example of how the WHO intervened by providing a new neutral name in order to avoid cultural stigma or negative impressions about a specific population group.
Thanks, Xiaoshun. I'm going to come back to you in a few minutes. I have more questions about race and culture for you. Well, you've all just been hearing Dr. Collins talk about animal health and Dr. Kearns talk about human health, and our next guest is going to help us talk through the connection between those two things. Dr. Peter Rabinowitz is a professor at the University of Washington, Departments of Environmental and Occupational Health Science for Family Medicine and Global Health. He's an adjunct professor in the Department of Medicine, Division of Allergy and Infectious Disease, and very important to this conversation, he's the director of the University of Washington Center for One Health Research. Dr. Rabinowitz has joined us live in the studio here in Seattle, and he's on our global health stage. Let's go meet him. Hi, Dr. Rabinowitz. How are you?
Good.
Thanks for being here with us.
Well, it's a wonderful panel, and it's great. I saw the boa from a distance, so it's fantastic.
Well, speaking of the boa, you saw Anahi, you heard Dr. Joppa talking about his affection. I understand that you also have a soft spot for Woodland Park Zoo reptiles. Is that right?
I do, yeah. As a kid growing up in Seattle, I was fascinated by animals, and the Woodland Park Zoo was the place to go to really connect with a lot of different types of animals. So when I was a teenager, I then became a volunteer keeper at the zoo, and I got to work in the reptile house and also with the birds of prey, and also to see a little bit of what the zoo veterinarian did as well. And it was just an amazing opportunity to go behind the scenes, as Darin was saying, and to work with the animals. And that was the first time that I ever heard about the idea that we could possibly have diseases that go between people and animals. And I was told as I was working in the reptile house, these reptiles are healthy, but they may carry some microbes that could make you sick, so make sure you wash your hands after working with the animal. And it really made me realize that there are these pathogens, but also if we handle it correctly, we can control the sort of exchange of microbes between animals and people. So,
well, I love that you've kept your partnership up with the zoo, because here you are today.
Yeah.
And we invited you here because of many reasons, but in particular your role with the Center for One Health. Can you tell us what that is?
Yeah, so even though I went into human medicine, became a physician, I really have always been impressed by the connection between the environment and animals and human health. And so I became very interested both in environmental health, but also in these zoonotic diseases that go between people and animals. And that's now sort of my specialty in terms of research. And so I came to the university, back to University of Washington about 7 years ago to start a Center for One Health. And One Health is the concept that we've been talking about today, which is that the health of people and animal populations and the environment that we share are all really connected. And zoonotic diseases like COVID-19 are examples of the close connections we have and how we have to kind of realize that. And as the Dr. Joppa from Microsoft was saying, we have to we have to really understand it much better than we understand right now.
Well, I understand that 20 years ago, there was a particular incident or a particular case that really sparked your interest in this health relationship between animals and humans. Can you tell us what happened 20 years ago?
Well, about 20 years ago, I mean, we've seen more and more of these zoonotic disease events coming of new viruses and other infections going between people and animals. But about 20 years ago, when I was getting into academic medicine, all of a sudden around the Bronx Zoo in New York, there was a bunch of crows that were dying, and nobody knew sort of what to make of that. And the veterinarian at the zoo in the Bronx Zoo was the one who said, this is something different. I'm going to investigate this, and was able to get some specimens, tried to send them to the CDC. The CDC said, we do people medicine, we don't work with animals, we don't work with crows. So it took actually a couple months for the crows to get analyzed and realize that this was the first appearance of West Nile virus in the Western Hemisphere. And it was just a real clear evidence that when animals are getting sick, maybe there's something that human health people need to pay attention to.
Well, I'm sure lots of us remember West Nile virus and probably didn't know that story that you just shared, so thanks for teaching us something. You know, as we're thinking about humans and our environment, what do you think we can learn from animals?
Well, you know, we can learn, I think, a lot from COVID-19, and we really need to understand better how it did emerge from animals into people. And unfortunately, that's one area we have not researched very much. There's been very little research on the actual origins of how it may have gone from a bat virus to over into another animal maybe, and then into humans. We also can learn when animals are not getting sick sometimes, because there's been, we're doing a study actually of people in households who have COVID who also have pets. And it looks like the animals may be getting infected, but they're not getting infected very much, and they're not spreading it, and it doesn't seem like there's a big risk to people right now. So there is something we could really learn from animals, that if they're not getting that sick, how can we actually learn about what their defense mechanisms are that we could use for human health as well?
Well, and I know you're looking for folks to participate in that study, so we'll post a link in the live chat if anyone here in the area wants to get involved.
Fantastic.
So my last question for you, you also fill another role as the co-director of the Alliance for Pandemic Preparedness. Can you talk about what that is and why partnerships are important in that work? Yeah,
well, the University of Washington has a real interest in global health and issues and pandemics. And so we formed several years ago, before COVID-19, a real group of people at the university to say, what could the university do that's special to help all these global efforts about pandemics? And so we brought together people working in laboratories, people working out in the field, and to really putting all our efforts together to do something about pandemics. And now that COVID has happened, we're very busy, obviously. And one of the things we're trying to do with the Center of One Health Research is bring in the kind of the animal component and the environmental component into the work we're doing for pandemics. And we're now part of a NIH Center for Emerging Infectious Diseases that's working around the world. And the NIH now is really asking centers like ours to bring in the wildlife perspective, the other animals, and what's happening with mosquitoes and other insects that could be spreading diseases, and is really starting to embrace a much more kind of a One Health approach to these pandemics. So we're working on pandemic prevention in general, but we're helping bring sort of the animal health and environment into all that effort.
Well, that's so interesting. Thank you for being here today. Thanks for your partnership. For those of you who want to learn more about Dr. Rabinowitz and his work, we're posting some links in the live chat. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to say one other thing, which is that we're continuing in our efforts. We're really partnering with the zoo on a lot of these efforts. It's been great for me, having been a teenager working at the zoo, to now be working with the zoo in a whole different way. But it's such a valuable resource for pushing all these new ideas forward.
Well, thank you. And we love partnering with you too, so let's keep it going.
Fantastic.
I want to go back to the stage and ask Dr. Kern a follow-up question. So returning to our main stage, Dr. Kern, how are partnerships important in your work? And we just heard Dr. Rabinowitz talking about the same thing.
Well, partnerships are extremely important, especially with an organization like University of Washington, which we've been collaborating with since the Gates Foundation was established in late 90s, in Seattle. And so, partnerships help us bring together people with different perspectives and different resources. Some of our strongest partners are also with the NIH. We meet annually with the leadership of the NIH to see what are they investing in and what are we investing in, so we can do things that are complementary. We work with US government, with foreign governments around the globe to really make sure that the efforts and the projects that we're working on can actually be complementary and not duplicative in a way that wouldn't be productive at all. And that's how you start to learn about this interface between animals and humans and this connection between things that then bring in collaborative people who have very different perspectives but can actually help and learn from each other in that regard. A great example on one of the pandemic projects I was working on, Zika, the technology actually, I was approached by people from the Audubon Society in Hawaii, because it turns out that in Hawaii, the natural birds are really struggling with an avian version of malaria. And the intervention that we were using for human disease, for dengue, might actually be useful for what they want to do in malaria. And so they're exploring an opportunity to collaborate where they'll take some of our learning, apply it to their system, and hopefully help save the natural birds that are still in existence in Hawaii.
A great example, thank you. Dr. Collins, same question for you. You mentioned it a little bit earlier. Why are partnerships important in your work?
I'm one person. One person can make a big difference and make a huge impact on all of us. And my job is to find the best person or persons to bring those specialties to the zoo to actually provide the best possible care for the animal collection at the zoo. And it's a principle that we take into the field as well. So if we're working at the zoo or in the field on field projects, we want the best people possible to help answer the questions. We can't do everything. And as a veterinarian, I know that I'm taking care of 300 species, over 1,000 individuals. We need a team, and we need experts, we need professionals. And sometimes those professionals are members of universities, academic groups, NGOs, foundations. And the goal is just to help us with our research, with our care and welfare at the zoo. And it's not about egos. It's about providing the best possible care and welfare for the animals.
Thanks, Darin. Well, talking about partnerships as a way to address global health and this pandemic is a great way for us to transition to our next topic, and that's conservation. But before we move on, I'd like to ask all of you a question, and this time it's about you. We're not going to put the results up, but these questions help us know who we're talking to and how you've engaged with us. So please open your live chat and let us know. Have you watched 1, 2, or all 3 episodes? And I'd also like to know who you are. Are you a student? Are you a zoo member or volunteer? Are you a donor? Are you tuned in today to watch one of our panelists and support a friend? Did you stumble upon us randomly and stick around to watch? When you get a moment, please open your live chat and respond with how we're connected and how many episodes you've watched. Thank you. Now let's take this opportunity to hear from one of Woodland Park Zoo's conservation partners. This is Dr. Kai Kawanishi, General Manager and Head of Conservation with the Malaysian Conservation Alliance for Tigers, also known as MyCat, to share with us the impacts and observations she's seen of this pandemic on their work in the field in Malaysia.
Hello everyone, I'm Kai Kawanishi, General Manager of MyCat. With a motto of saving tigers together, our inclusive conservation program called Citizen Action for Tiger Walk, aka Cat Walk, extended togetherness in saving tigers beyond the NGOs and government to local communities and global citizens like yourself. Cat Walk is an anti-poaching surveillance walk conducted by citizen conservationists. Many American zookeepers, for example, became protectors of critically endangered Malayan tigers and continue to be the ambassadors. I wish you could join us in the celebration of 10th year anniversary of Catwalk end of this year. As for the impact of the pandemic, Malaysia did a great job in keeping COVID-19 under control. Our movement was restricted to within 6-mile radius from home, and people violating the order were arrested every day, both in cities and villages. The strict movement control made the transport of goods and people difficult, and that was great for wildlife. You see, many of the commercially valuable wildlife are smuggled to China. And many of the poachers here are from Indochina. The lockdown effectively stopped the trafficking of both dead wildlife and deadly foreign poachers. Local poachers and middlemen who would usually supply essential items to foreign poachers in remote forests were also locked down. People around here cannot live long without rice and sugar. All NGOs had to stop non-essential activities, but the Wildlife Department and police continued patrolling the forest and did not find sign of poaching. Good news is, it was not just the poaching that stopped. Logging, mining, and industrial agriculture also had to stop. So yes, to the planet Earth. Malaysian rainforest is incredibly diverse and resilient. During the lockdown, it rained a lot, and the reforestation site became full of growing new lives, including weeds. Not that kind of weeds. And our camera traps captured so many otherwise vulnerable wildlife in the vibrant forest. The year 2020 was the best year for Malaysia's rainforest and wildlife, therefore for me too. I took a break. However, now that the movement control is relaxed, humans are back in business, logging, poaching, and our citizen conservation. When I'm in the wild, I am one with the world around me and inside of me. It is people who divide and break it into pieces, isn't it? On that note, from the bottom of my heart, I would like to thank all our volunteers, community rangers, and donors who supported Catwalk for the past decade. That includes Woodland Park Zoo and U.S. Fish and Wildlife. Because of all of you, some of the critically endangered Malayan tigers are still surviving in the wild. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kai. We've heard from several of our conservation partners over the past 3 episodes about the negative effects of this pandemic, and so it's really nice to hear from you that you're seeing some good news for the tigers. We're posting a link in the live chat for those who want to learn more or support MyCat. With that said, there's a couple of things in that message that I'd like to discuss with our panel. Dr. Meyer, we heard Dr. Kawanishi talking about government restrictions around travel in Malaysia, which she credits with limiting poachers' access to wildlife. Your focus is more on oceans. Why does that present a challenge for you that maybe land-based conservation doesn't face?
Yeah, so while governments put restrictions on air travel and in some case international travel, so movement across lands and in some cases across borders were restricted, you can't close down access to the ocean. And so there's actually a study that pooled together data from marine protected areas from around the world that's actually revealing that we saw an increase in poaching, an increase in violations of marine protected area regulations, and in some cases also an increase in fishing pressure in some of the multi-use zones within marine protected areas. But all of it, of course, makes a bit of sense, because we've, for decades in the conservation landscape, have been working toward shifting people's livelihoods away from extractive activities to, oftentimes, tourism. So when you shut down tourism, you're functionally shutting down people's ability to make money and provide for their families. And so they have to find another way to provide for their families, and oftentimes that means reverting back to things like fishing and hunting and harvesting. And not just for food for themselves and for their families, but also to make a little bit of money to pay for the things that they can't harvest out in the wild. So there is a little bit of a different impact in travel restrictions for land versus ocean-based ecosystems.
Thanks, Erin. And I want to come back to you in a minute with a question about livelihoods. Mr. Zeng, another thing that we just heard Kai talk about in her video was the fact that there's belief that poachers are going into Malaysia and they are poaching tigers to take back into China. Can you talk to us about why that might be happening?
Yeah, thank you for asking. So as I mentioned earlier, tiger is my favorite animal, but very sadly, in China today, tigers are critically endangered or even possibly extinct in the wild. And so today, it's a sad truth that tigers or tiger parts are trafficked to China to meet the demands on the black market. And one of the important reasons for the demand for tiger is the belief that tiger bones can be used as medicinal parts in traditional Chinese medicine. And actually, there is no scientific evidence to prove the efficacy of tiger bones as a remedy. And in 1993, the Chinese government banned the use of tiger bones and the trade of tiger bones as a medicine. And the government removed tiger bones as a medicinal part from the Chinese pharmacopoeia. But still, there is a very active black market for the trafficking tiger parts, especially tiger bones.
Thank you. And so you've just said that scientific evidence does not support the use of tigers or other wildlife necessarily as a source of food or medicine. So would you describe these practices as widely practiced and mainstream, or would you say that they are more controversial and sort of on the fringe?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think in terms of the consumption of wildlife in China, they're generally trafficked for the purpose of either medicine or food. And it might be helpful to talk about food and medicine separately. I think in terms of using wildlife as a source of food is definitely very controversial in China, and it's definitely not the mainstream. Certainly in some parts of China, and some people do consume wildlife as a source of food. But most of people in China strongly disapprove of these practices. And in fact, most people in China cannot have access to or afford these very rare or exotic wildlife. And in terms of traditional Chinese medicine, so traditional Chinese medicine is a healing system that use herbal, animal or mineral remedies to cure illnesses. So today, about 1,000 plant species and 36 animal species are used as ingredients or remedies in traditional Chinese medicine. And the fact is, not everything among these species have scientifically proved efficacy. And in fact, the government has banned the trade of many of these species. I think, to my knowledge, 28 species are banned because they are potentially poisonous, and 42 protected animal or plant species are also banned because they are vulnerable, endangered. And traditional Chinese medicine itself is actually a controversial topic, and not everyone approve it. And the government encouraged an updated pharmacopoeia to remove the endangered species of protected animals and plants from the pharmacopoeia.
Well, and let me ask you, because you have a very interesting perspective about what the word traditional means when we talk about traditional Chinese medicine. Can you share with us?
Oh, yeah, sure. So tradition as idea is definitely a modern creation in the context of China. And in China, the word traditional is often used to defend a practice that's been marginalized. So in effect, if something is traditional in China today, it's often because that practice or thing has been marginalized. So in the case of traditional Chinese medicine, so it's a fact that the healing system in China, the mainstream healing system, of course, is modern biomedicine. If you visit hospital in China, it's no different from the one in the United States. Except that it's more affordable or less expensive. So for the case of traditional Chinese medicine, actually, the public view about it is, can go to two extremes. Critics of traditional Chinese medicine would say that it's superstition, it's not scientific, it's simply placebo effects, or some even encourage the government to totally abolish this healing system, while activists or proponents for traditional Chinese medicine would argue that it's tradition, it's part of the cultural traditional values. Some of its remedies do prove efficacious, or it's kind of holistic medicine, alternative medicine to modern biomedicine. So you can really have extreme views, and it's definitely a topic. It's definitely not a topic to talk about on the dinner table or post on social media. Your friends might unfriend you if they hold a different extreme view with you about traditional Chinese medicine. But in my own perspective, I think it is a tradition. It could be useful. It's definitely not a good idea to abolish traditional Chinese medicine in China. But we also need to keep in mind that it needs, the medicine system itself needs to be updated. I mean, we definitely need to remove ingredients that not scientifically proved efficacious, or especially those endangered, animal or plant species. We don't need to actually use them in the pharmacopoeia. We can have a modern, updated traditional Chinese medicine that's still effective as alternative medicine in China. I think that's a better solution to this situation.
Thanks, Xiaoshun. And I know some of these conversations about like culture and race can be a little bit difficult to navigate, so I appreciate you having this talk with us. Dr. Meyer, I'd like to come back to you about something you mentioned earlier, and that's how livelihoods and culture are inextricably tied together. Why is that important for us to understand in the context of conservation?
So I think we were just hearing a little bit about that too, but so as I was mentioning earlier, we've been working in conservation to shift livelihoods away from extractive practices. But even that framing, using that framing, actually dehumanizes the issue that we're talking about. Humans, like any other live organism on the planet, have needs. We require food, we require water, shelter, medicine, and safety. And if one of those is no longer available to us, we have to find another way to get at that resource that is necessary. So if, in the case of what's happening right now with the pandemic, if we can no longer make money through tourism, okay, now we have to go back to harvesting resources to feed ourselves, to shelter ourselves, and to shelter our families. And I think this actually gets back to something that I was talking about at the very beginning with conservation. We can't separate humans from conservation. Conservation is, as I said earlier, it by definition is both environmental and human health. And you can't actually achieve human health without that lens of environmental justice. And by that, I mean making sure that everybody has access to food, water, shelter, medicine, and safety in their daily lives.
Thanks, Erin. Well, we have one more message for all of you from a conservation partner. This is Dr. Amy Dickman, Kaplan Senior Research Fellow at the University of Oxford and Director of the Ruaha Carnivore Project, here to tell us about how this pandemic has impacted their work in the field in Tanzania.
Hi everyone, my name's Dr. Amy Dickman and I'm the Director of the Ruaha Carnivore Project in Tanzania. And we're so grateful for all the support that Woodland Park Zoo has given us, and it's nice to be able to engage in this debate and discussion even remotely while we're all dealing with these very challenging times. And just to give you an idea of what we do in the field, we work very closely with local communities to try to reduce human-carnivore conflict and try to ensure that local people get real tangible benefits from the presence of wildlife rather than just suffering the costs of conservation. This has been work that we've been doing now for a decade, and Woodland Park Zoo has been an important provider of support for that. But COVID-19 has obviously really impacted not only our work but conservation work across the globe. It has obviously brought travel to a standstill, and many of the conservation activities across Africa, particularly rangers in national parks, are really dependent upon that kind of revenue from tourism for their day-to-day operations and anti-poaching patrols. So we've certainly seen that the pandemic has had real impacts at a continental scale in terms of increasing the likelihood of poaching and those sorts of costs of conservation. It hasn't, interestingly, really affected what we do on the ground too much because we are a very locally based team. We're not that dependent externally. And that's really shown us the resilience of having these donor-based conservation models where the focus is on building local capacity. And the other thing that the pandemic has revealed is how important it is moving forward that we think about global health in terms of animal health and human health and wildlife and planetary health all combined. And for that to work, we need intact, big ecosystems. And for those to be delivered in a human-dominated world, we need conservation to be done in concert with local people and driven by the needs of local people. We do that on a small scale in Ruaha with the help of Woodland Park and other partners, but we really think it's highlighted the significance of this kind of work and how important it is that we continue doing this. We scale up because it's not just about the immediate poaching. It's about showing that wildlife and wildlife habitats are the way forward out of poverty for local people, and that we can build a better world where we are all healthier, where our nature is healthier, and it means that it not only reduces pandemic risk, but delivers development goals as well, and is something that we're really proud to be a small part of, and we hope to continue that support and that discussion with you guys as well. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Amy. For anyone who wants to learn more about Dr. Dickman's work or support Ruaha, we're posting a link in the live chat. Dr. Meyer, we just heard from Dr. Dickman about a decline in tourism and donor-based conservation models. You've already started to talk about this. Can you elaborate a little bit more and talk to us about what you see as the future funding models for conservation?
Yeah, so there's some actually really exciting conversations happening right now and have been maybe started maybe 5 or 10 years ago, but they're propelling forward far faster right now, thank you to the situation that we're in. Where we're kind of looking for a more diversified funding model for conservation. Think about it in the same way as your own investments or your retirement account. You're not going to use that money to invest in a single place. That wouldn't be safe for you, because if something happens to that single investment, you're out all of your retirement funds. And it's the same thing for conservation. We have to build a diversified portfolio to fund these really exciting projects like the one you just heard about in Tanzania, so that your funding isn't just coming from some of these more traditional ways that we think about it, like a fee structure of some kind for entering into a park or to be able to go on a tour, and of course the donor-based structure. Those are still really important parts of the portfolio going forward, but some of the exciting things that are starting to emerge are these really innovative investment portfolios, quite literally, that people can invest directly into these portfolios to invest into conservation projects. And another one that I feel like is hot off the press in the last couple of years is carbon markets, and figuring out ways to funnel funding from industries who are trying to offset their carbon footprint, and organizations like the zoo and the aquarium. We do carbon offset programs that we can actually take that funding and invest it right back into conservation projects. And that can create a really dependable lifeline for those projects to move forward, so that as donor models are going up and down, as tourism maybe shuts down because there's another pandemic, we have a lifeline of funding that's coming in through that carbon platform. And those projects are continuing to grow and provide actually a really exciting opportunity for the donors and the industry members and those organizations that are investing in those projects to get to know what's happening on the ground and learn a little bit more about these incredible projects, and really invest themselves in helping them move forward.
Thanks, Erin. That's awesome. Well, in addition to hearing about wildlife conservation, you just heard from our partners at MyCat and Ruaha about the threat and impact of wildlife poaching, and that helps us segue to our third major topic of today's discussion, wildlife trafficking. So I hope you'll hang in here for that. On this note, we're going to hear a message from Woodland Park Zoo's Director of Government Affairs, Kirsten Swartz.
I'm Kirsten Swartz, Director of Government Affairs and Advocacy at Woodland Park Zoo, and I'm here today to share some hopeful news with you about animals. First, a few statistics. A survey conducted by the Wildlife Trafficking Alliance of the Association of Zoos and Aquariums found that about 40% of people polled are familiar with wildlife trafficking, but once they had a better understanding of what it is, about 90% of them said wildlife trafficking is a serious problem. This tells me that we need to do more to inform people about these crimes so that we create a groundswell of concerned people motivated to stop wildlife trafficking. We also found the public believes that one of the most important actions zoos and aquariums can take is to support wildlife conservation legislation. As someone who asks lawmakers every day to do right by animals, I like that you support my work and know it's the right place for us to be. Here's the hopeful part. Across the nation, zoos and aquariums, including Woodland Park Zoo, have worked to pass policies banning the sale of illegal wildlife products, and we continue to partner with governmental agencies to enforce laws that restrict the unnecessary and often cruel poaching of animals. These bans exist in Washington State, Oregon, California, and Hawaii, essentially closing the Pacific Ocean's largest ports to illegal wildlife trade. In addition to flexing our advocacy muscles, zoos and aquariums also serve as communicators to our audiences. We send up flares about how this moment in time is critical to the survival of species, including humans. Our job for over 100 years has been to tell stories. Now the story we must tell is one of action and hope. I urge you to seize this moment and write to your elected officials to tell them how important wildlife is to you. Please join Woodland Park Zoo and all of our partners here today in our fight for nature. We will welcome you with open arms. Thank you.
Thanks, Kirsten. Our next guest is here to help us bring some perspective to our discussion around poaching and wildlife trafficking. Levi Novi is an outreach and education specialist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Mr. Novi, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
I hear you had an interesting coronavirus hobby that you've developed over the past couple of months.
Yes, so during the start of the pandemic, one morning my family and I woke up and we saw a red fox that was actually walking across the fence in our backyard. And so we decided to put a camera there, called a camera trap, and see what other kinds of animals might be using the fence too. And we did that across the spring and most of the summer. And it was really fun each morning to wake up and see which animals were crossing the fence. And we were delighted to really see that it was kind of like a super highway for raccoons, for possums, for a lot of squirrels, of course. And in the daytime, we saw a lot of birds too. But certainly the highlight was seeing a family of raccoons several times and a baby possum that seemed to grow up before our very eyes.
I love that video. That is so cute. Well, there's some belief that the current pandemic can be traced to wildlife or wildlife trafficking. Can you explain that for us?
Yes, so illegal wildlife trade or wildlife trafficking happens across the world. And in many places, wildlife is sold in markets. And there was some speculation that perhaps from bats or from an animal called pangolins, which are believed to be one of the most heavily trafficked animals in the world, people consuming these animals might be responsible for starting the pandemic. So far, the science that I have seen and the research has not confirmed that. We do know that some animals like bats can carry coronaviruses, but the link between these animals is still not entirely understood. I think that the take-home message that we can have is that anytime that animals that are close together that are not normally close together in the wild are there, and there's also humans around, there's the possibility of disease transmission. And as many of the previous guests have pointed out, that can have really serious implications for both conservation and for human health.
Thanks, Levi. And you've heard us as we've been talking about the livelihoods and culture when it comes to conservation, and most of that discussion so far has been focused on international communities. How would you describe the role of livelihoods and wildlife trafficking here in the U.S.?
Yes, so absolutely. I'm really glad that the other panelists brought that up. Poverty is a really major driver for even people who love animals to participate in the legal wildlife trade around the world. If their incomes and their livelihoods for their families are at stake, they need alternatives. So in the United States, the situation is a little bit different from what we know. The United States is a major consumer of illegal wildlife. We are Office of Law Enforcement. We have inspectors and we have law enforcement agents, and they do investigations. They seize items at our borders that come in that are not legally permitted. And so we've been trying to educate the public about that. We've also been trying to learn more and do more research about the species that are domestic from the United States that might be exiting our borders and going abroad illegally. And we don't know as much as we'd like. Our investigations do yield some interesting information. And one of the groups of animals that I think is worth talking about are freshwater turtles. In the United States, we actually have a lot of unique species of freshwater turtles that are found nowhere else in the world. And the United States does actually do a lot of sustainable and legal trade of our turtles abroad. So in those cases, we know that the turtles are okay. But in some cases, people choose to poach the turtles from the wild for different reasons. Sometimes they can be sold into the pet trade because of unique characteristics. Sometimes people abroad want to use them for breeding or for food. One of the turtles, to give you a specific example, is called the bog turtle. They live in the eastern United States. They're very small, even as adults. They can fit into the palm of your hand. And that's made them very attractive in the pet trade. However, we really want to make sure that these turtles exist for generations to come. And so it's our goal to protect them in the wild.
Thanks, Levi. And, you know, I'm guessing that a lot of the folks in our audience today aren't the ones who are perpetrating this wildlife trafficking. So how would you say that this issue impacts the lives of people like our audience?
Sure, absolutely. So my guess is that most of the people watching are not trafficking wildlife. Thank you for that. However, it will impact us. We know that wildlife trafficking is driving species that we've probably never heard of to extinction. And also many well-known species such as elephants, tigers, which we've talked a lot about today, rhinos, lots of parrots, and thousands of species are threatened with extinction because of wildlife trafficking. So from the time most of us Americans grow up as kids, animals are part of our lives. They're in storybooks, they're in movies, they're in songs, they're part of our culture. They're part of our toys, stuffed animals, almost anything. And so I've seen research that even says that children, most of their dreams are focused on animals. I can certainly say that I still dream about animals. And so we are profoundly emotionally and intellectually connected to animals and plants and the world around us. And so even though we might not be trafficking, we stand a lot to lose. The pandemic has taught so many of us that we have a lot to lose, that we shouldn't take anything for granted. And so by helping protect wildlife from trafficking, we're going to protect these animals for generations to come, so we don't feel as many of those losses as could potentially happen.
Thanks, Mr. Novi. My earliest memories of dreams are of animals too, so that really speaks to me. So what can we do? You know, those of us in the studio, those watching, what can we do to help save these irreplaceable animals?
So I came with 3 specific ways that the audience can help to protect wildlife from trafficking. The first is that within the United States, if you think you are observing wildlife crime, either online or potentially in person, our Office of Law Enforcement has a TIPS hotline. There's a phone number that I believe is going to be put into the chat that you can call. We also have an email address that you can send an email to. And we actually have a rewards program as well. If the information that you supply leads to an arrest or a conviction, we can actually sometimes give rewards for that. So there's a financial benefit. The second way that I would like to mention are that we have some guides, or if you like to travel abroad, perhaps after the pandemic ends. I know that me and my family, we love to buy souvenirs. And so we have some guides that tell you what kinds of threatened species might actually be something you could unwittingly buy. And then if you brought it back to the United States, it might get confiscated. So these guides can help you, as we say, to be informed and buy informed. The final way are the Save Endangered Species stamps. We love these. This is a postal stamp you can buy online from the Postal Service or from your local post office. And a significant portion of the proceeds from buying these stamps goes back to us at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And we issue grants to conservation partners around the world who do great, fantastic on-the-ground conservation projects for tigers, elephants, great apes, sea turtles, and rhinos. And many of these projects actually help to stop trafficking and to stop poaching through the work of local partners. And we have some fantastic stories on our website about the impact of those stamps. We love for people to tell us their stories about them. They're also, I should say, since the holidays are not that far away, a great thing to buy to bring a smile to not only your face, but to the people who you might send a letter or a note to for the holidays.
Well, that's great, Levi. Thank you so much for being here. For anyone who wants to learn more, we're posting some resources in the live chat, and we're also going to post a link to the tiger stamps that Mr. Novi just talked about. Take care, Levi.
Thank you.
Well, speaking of doing something to help save animals and stop wildlife trafficking, we have a very special message from Washington State Attorney General Bob Ferguson about what his office is doing in the prosecution of cases under the Anti-Wildlife Trafficking Act here in Washington State.
Hi, everybody. I'm Attorney General Bob Ferguson, and talking to you from my kids' playroom in our basement in our North Seattle home. And first, I want to start by saying, hey, thanks to all of you for supporting the Woodland Park Zoo, such an important institution in our community. And I'm going to speak to you for a few minutes about work we are doing in my office with the assistance of the Woodland Park Zoo related to the illegal wildlife trafficking, a hugely important issue. Before I do that, I just need to say I have received my renewal notice for our family zoo membership, just came in the mail. So I just want you to know, you can let your membership director know, Colleen and I are going to put in the mail right away. My kids, I ascribe much of their love for animals and wildlife. They're 12 years old, they're twins, just having spent a lot of time at the zoo. And they love going, they still love going, and it's just a huge part of their lives right now. And so I want to say thanks to the zoo for all you offer for kids like my kids and to our whole community. Look, as many of you know, the people of the state of Washington passed really a groundbreaking initiative, Initiative 1401, and that's a ban on illegal trafficking of endangered species. Guess what? The Office of the Attorney General enforces that law. But the zoo and the supporters of the zoo played a key role in education around that initiative that helped get that approved by the voters. So last year, my office filed the first ever criminal charges under that initiative. The individuals pled guilty, and we've subsequently filed additional cases related to the enforcement of that initiative. That is hugely important for endangered species. It's hugely important to send a message that folks who engage in that illegal activity will be held accountable. And in fact, the day that we announced at a press conference the enforcement of that first case, guess where we held that press conference? It was at the Woodland Park Zoo, because of that partnership we've had really from day one with the zoo. So just speaking as the Attorney General for the people of the state of Washington, I just want to say how much I appreciate, as the Attorney General, the work of the zoo. And I also want to speak as a parent on how much we appreciate the zoo and what it provides for our kids. And as someone who grew up here in Seattle, I'm a fourth generation Washingtonian, my parents instilled in me and my 6 siblings a love of the zoo as well. So it's an important institution, and I just really appreciate everyone supporting this wonderful institution, and I hope you're all staying safe and healthy during this really challenging time. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Attorney General Ferguson. We're really grateful for your support and your partnership. Well, I hope our discussion so far has painted a picture for all of you about the connection between health, conservation, and wildlife trafficking. And now I'd like to come back to our panel for one last question each about what comes next. So Dr. Collins, from an animal health perspective, how do we prevent or minimize the impacts of a future pandemic?
That's a loaded question. We're talking today about COVID-19. 10 years ago, it could have been a bird flu conversation. 30 years ago, West Nile virus. I don't think this is over. I think influenza is here. I think COVID is here. And we have to be smarter moving forward about how we interact with the environment and the animals that are part of that environment, and change our human behavior globally to keep something like a next pandemic contained.
Thanks, Darin. Dr. Meyer, what changes have to take place in order to have an ongoing, sustainable conservation model?
Well, I think the changes are already underway. I feel like one of the themes of this session today has been about partnerships. And I think in terms of conservation, that is absolutely key to the long-term success of this work. Understanding the needs of the communities and the place where they work is going to take place, understanding the cultural context within which that's happening, that's the future of conservation, is really figuring out how we ensure that we have diverse voices sitting at the table to co-create the questions, co-create the methodology, and co-create what those solutions are going to be. That's the future of conservation. I feel like this pandemic is propelling us forward so quickly on that pathway, whether or not we wanted to get there so quickly. And it's amazing, and I think just over the course of the last hour and a bit, hearing no matter what perspective, what panelists we're talking about, everybody's talking about the importance of partnerships. And partnerships to me, and in the context of conservation, means diverse voices, it means diverse solutions are going to be possible. And so I think for conservation to be sustainable and find its way forward, it's kind of going back to the beginning and making sure that we are seating diverse people around the table, both in terms of perspectives and cultures, so that we can understand how to do the work and then how to get there.
Thanks, Erin. Xiaoshun, as we think about the history of race and disease, what can we learn from the past to help us be better moving forward?
Yeah, history is actually full of sad and alarming facts that how we human beings have treated other species and people from other races so badly. But I think it's never too late to make changes. I mean, by beginning, make changes, I mean, treating other species, especially wild animals, with respect, and promote more better relations across different races of people in the whole planet. We can make a better one world for all of us across different species and races on this planet.
Thanks, Xiaoshun. Dr. Kern, I'm looking to you to give us some good news.
Good news.
What have we learned, let's say, from cases like Ebola that can give us hope for the future?
I think we've learned a lot, actually. And one of the things that you can look at, to take Ebola as an example, just yesterday, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration approved a therapeutic for Ebola. So we now have treatments for Ebola. We have a vaccine that's incredibly effective for Ebola. And that Ebola motivated the efforts to put together a collaborative of organizations that work on new vaccines. And you see right now with COVID, we have dozens of candidates that are coming forward. So we have lots of opportunity for something good. So at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we call ourselves impatient optimists. We are optimists. What we're learning is how we have to get ahead of these conditions, how we have to pay attention to not just the disease itself, but the system into which the disease exists, because this is a problem that not just hurts people's health, but also the way they operate, the way they live, the way they thrive. And so if we're going to have solutions, it's not just a drug, it's not just a vaccine, it's a real ecosystem, if you will, of solutions that we have to work on together.
Thanks, Steve. Wow, what an amazing discussion we've had today. When we started this hour, I asked you a question for the live poll. And now that you've heard from our panelists and our guests, let's revisit a version of that question. So please open your live chat function, and here's the question. Do you believe that wildlife conservation is an important part of preventative global health? Type 1 for I don't believe it's important. Type 2 for I believe it's slightly important. Type 3 for I believe it's very important. Or type 4 for I believe it is a critical and indivisible relationship. While you're typing in your answer, I'd like to thank you for watching today. If you joined us for just this episode, or you've been here with us for all 3 weeks, we hope you've taken away a greater understanding about the connectedness of our world, the threats we all face, and the solutions that we can achieve together. Over the past 3 weeks, we've explored this pandemic, global health, climate and environmental threats, endangered species, wildlife trafficking, and so much more. This series has highlighted the problem that we can't just pay attention to these issues in moments of crisis. Our 3 panels and our 4 panelists have offered suggestions and solutions to prevent the next crisis. And it's now on all of us to build resilient wildlife populations, healthy communities, and a sustainable planet. I hope you feel empowered to do your part. Now, let's check out the results of the poll. We asked all of you, do you believe that wildlife conservation is an important part of preventative global health care? And it looks like 100% of you said that you believe it is a critical and indivisible relationship. That's amazing. Well, thank you for joining us today for One World, How a Human and an Animal Changed Global Health. Thanks for being here to our in-studio panelists, Dr. Darin Collins, Dr. Erin Meyer, Dr. Stephen Kern, Mr. Xiaoshun Zeng, and our special visits from Mr. Peter Rabinowitz and Ms. Rachel Salant. Thank you to our video guests, Dr. Lucas Joppa and Mr. Levi Novi. And finally, thank you to our pre-recorded video guests, Attorney General Bob Ferguson, Dr. Kai Kawanishi, Dr. Amy Dickman, and Ms. Kirsten Swartz. All 3 episodes in this series have been recorded and will be available at zoo.org/onewildworld. Woodland Park Zoo's website also has Common Core discussion prompts available for middle and high school students and teachers who want to do a deep dive into today's discussion. Our true and sincere thanks to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for the grant that made this series possible. We could not have brought this series to you without their funding support. And our deepest gratitude to our talented partners at Seattle Lives and PNTA for all the great work they've done behind the camera and behind the scenes here in this studio to bring us to you live. I hope you've enjoyed today's event and this 3-part series. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for joining us for Woodland Park Zoo's One Wild World.